Thank you so much, Mr. Shupnik, for those comments. I would like to call to the stage the other members of this panel. First, I recognize David Zalessi, the Managing Director of Kaiser Space. Kaiser Space, for those of you who don't know, is a privately owned independent aerospace engineering company established in 1986. We're interested to hear their perspective on stimulating economic growth through investment in Africa. And also returning to this stage after giving us welcome remarks this morning, Professor Dr. Peter Eigen from Germany, a lawyer by training who founded Transparency International in 1993, and who, as he mentioned this morning, prior to that worked at the World Bank as a manager of programs in Africa and Latin America, as well as the director of regional mission for Eastern Africa for the World Bank from 1988 to 1991. Under the Ford Foundation sponsorship, he provided legal and technical assistance to the governments of Botswana and Namibia, both Commonwealth countries, to strengthen the legal framework for mining investments. From 1993 to 2005, Peter was the chair of Transparency International and now serves as the chair of the advisory council for that organization. In 2005, he chaired the International Advisory Group of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is a very important initiative we talked about a lot when I was with the government in Malawi working on mining, to ensure that the money that is coming into a country from the extractive industry, be it petroleum or mining, goes back to help those countries in Africa and around the world that have those resources. So he was the chairman of EITI from 2006 to February 2011, and is now the EITI special representative looking to increase transparency in the extractive industry. So please welcome both of those distinguished speakers to our panel, and they will offer their remarks on this topic. Mr. Zalessi, why don't you start us off with your thoughts on this topic for this panel?
So thank you for inviting me to talk to this event. It's an honor to me to be there. Let me start my speech asking the panel, the audience, a question. I'm from Italy, so I want to ask you, who among you know Cristoforo Colombo? I think most of you. You know Cristoforo Colombo? In the past, go and discover, maybe, well, for the was the second to discover America. But I want to ask you, you know why Cristoforo Colombo has to go and discover the new route to the American continent? Who want to try to give me an answer? No one? Please.
That land, now known as America, was referred to as a newfound land. And that sort of intrigued a lot of minds. And the only person that actually took action on it was Christopher Colombo. He wanted to find out what is this newfound land.
Yeah, it could be. So you want to discover something new. You want to bring the edge.
I'll offer another take on that. He was trying to cut out the middleman, which is what we're always trying to do in business, right? He was trying to cut out the Middle East was dominating the trade between China and Europe, and he was trying to cut out the middleman. We're all trying to do the same thing.
That's correct. But there's a technology reason. Can you think about that? There's a technology reason why Cristoforo Colombo had to discover. Because at that time, they didn't have any fridge. There's no fridge. So if you want to have meat for days, you need spices. So Christopher Colombo want to cut the man in the middle, but because we want to have a direct access to a fridge. So there's a technology gap. There's a technology need. And in this era, we also have a technology need. We also have some technology needs. And we are now facing a new era in the space sector, which is the sector in which my company works. So we are now facing the commercialization of the space sector. To give you some numbers, the space economy worth more than 300 billion of pounds worldwide. Is a huge economy. Most of this is in telecommunication and TV broadcasting. That's true, or internet. But it is true that space let the people dream. And we, in the previous speech we heard, we understand how important it is not only to have a goal, but to have a dream, and then have some goal to reach that dream. And space could be this dream. So what we can do, so far, the space economy is mainly driven by Western country, and now by some other countries like China and like India. But Africa has to play its role in the future in the space sector. So it could be to let the younger people dream about their chance to be employed or have their own business, not as a self-man-made and one-man band business, but to have a small company. Of course, in order to have this, we need to set up the proper framework and environment to have some small company to grow up in Africa. But we need to start, so someone has to start. So that's my message to this audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to make a small intervention. I have to admit, my ambition is not as high as your dream in space. My interest is very much on Africa, on the reality of Africa, and as I said earlier, and I think Mrs. Cherry Blair confirmed that, I feel we should be very honest today to ourselves to admit that yes, there are chances, there have been progress, partly driven by high commodity prices during the last decade, but there are also huge problems ahead of us, and we have to face them very honestly, very realistically. In that sense, I will mainly focus on what I think is our task to discuss the speech of the previous speaker here, because his speech was very important. I have to admit I am biased because the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has been extremely important in promoting basically Transparency International and the fight against corruption. I mean, the 1997 Convention Against Foreign Bribery was an incredible breakthrough, and I never thought that the OECD, which had in the past always been a club of rich countries, that they would get so deeply involved in order to stop what used to be a real scandal until 1999 when the OECD Convention entered into force. That is to finally make sure that the signatories of the OECD Convention, and this were about 36 countries at the time, that they criminalize foreign bribery. Because what many of you may remember, until that time, until May 1999, and the OECD Convention has been put in place, it was allowed under German law to bribe systematically decision makers in Africa to take the wrong decisions. It was allowed in the UK, it was allowed in France, it was allowed in Japan, it was allowed in Canada. Only the United States had a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes it a crime for an American company to bribe outside the US. But of course, they were very jealous about this permissive, scandalous situation in all the other OECD countries. And so that the OECD was able to create a consensus was a tremendous step forward for creating better global governance. And I'm eternally grateful for that. But I also have to say we're part of it. And this brings me to the main message of what I want to say to you. I believe very strongly that a multi-stakeholder approach to big problems in governance is the answer to tremendous problems of bad governance in the world. At that time, even the German government didn't know what to do. They thought in the international globalized economy, there is no authority, there is no governance, and therefore everybody was bribing. And therefore the German government was convinced that it could not stop the Germans from going out to Kenya and bribing, say, a minister to take the wrong decisions about the huge damaging project which, say, the German company would then implement. So this was the situation which we had at that time. And there was a discussion going on at the OECD to create recommendations to the members of the OECD to stop international bribery. But the Germans were reluctant to participate in this. I had just created Transparency International at the time. We participated in the discussion, and the German minister tried to get us excluded from this discussion because he felt that we were offending the German government and its policies. But we were not excluded. And in fact, we even managed to have meetings in Germany, and this is an important example I want to raise here, with the German business community, with the German government, with other governments, and with civil society organizations, including our own Transparency International, in order to discuss whether a corruption-free international market would not be better, for instance, for German companies, for German exporters. And over the period of 2 years, we managed to convince the German leaders, and these were CEOs of big companies like Siemens, like Lufthansa, like ABB, and so on. They all came to a little island on the Wannsee in Germany under the chairmanship of Richard von Weizsäcker, who had just ended his presidency in Germany, to discuss with us what to do about international bribery. And out of this came a public letter after 3 sessions signed by these business leaders to Helmut Kohl and his minister, saying, please participate at the OECD and try to also stop this terrible thing of systematic international bribery. And this letter was sent, and the Germans insisted that this should not be only a recommendation, which is the normal way of the OECD to operate, but that this should be a binding convention. And so in 1997, a binding convention was signed, which makes it a crime, or which asks the signatories to make it a crime if their nationals bribe in the international market. So the interesting issue is now whether this tremendous threshold of better governance is being enforced. And the OECD, and I'm so proud to sit here next to the Deputy Director General of the OECD, is now trying very hard to make sure that indeed the requirements of this convention will be implemented. In fact, I have to admit to the great disgrace of the United Kingdom is that they didn't implement it. I mean, there the famous Al Yamama case, for instance, of British Aerospace bribing Saudi decision makers was basically stopped by the government when the Series 4 office was prosecuted. In fact, our friends and our chapter of Transparency International in the UK appealed against this decision and won the first High Court case. But then, unfortunately, the government appealed against that decision, and the House of Lords decided that indeed it was very important to not anger the royal family in Saudi Arabia, and therefore to stop this corruption case. It was an outrageous case where it was claimed that every year 100 million pounds sterling were paid to a particular person for 10 years in order to get a $44 billion contract for arms supplies from British Aerospace. Now, this was an incredible downfall for us in our fight against corruption. But in the meantime, of course, the government has changed here. The government has changed its position and has introduced very strict rules in the United Kingdom implement the OECD Convention and its binding international obligations. And I'm very proud about it because this really meant that all the signatories could change their votes in the board of the World Bank. And I was basically thrown out of the World Bank because the important countries in the World Bank did not want to stop international bribery of their officials. But after 1999, this all changed, and to the great credit of Jim Wilkinson, who was the president of the World Bank at the time, we now see the World Bank as a tremendous anti-corruption agency. So this is something which I think we have to keep in mind, in particular when a speech from the North, from the OECD, stresses and emphasizes very much how important it is to have a sound institutional framework, an enabling environment for investment, which has to be predictable, which has to be supported by independent courts and so on, all the things which we have just heard. So this is the context within which I would like to re-emphasize the importance of good governance for investments, for entrepreneurs in Africa. I have served under Kofi Annan for 10 years on the Africa Progress Panel, which had been created by Kofi Annan and Tony Blair, Prime Minister Blair at the time. And he tried with a sort of half African group of panelists and the other half prominent people like Michel Camdessus, for instance, or the famous economist, and this is supposed to be a joke now, Bob Geldof, and people like that. We try to create a mouthpiece for Africa to remind the world on what has been decided on the Millennium Development Goals. And these goals are still valid, even though sustainable development goals, which are now on the books, are even made more precise, more concrete. But coming back to my earlier message, what we need in order to enforce these standards are not recognized by everyone. We need multi-stakeholder approaches. And this is what I, for instance, experienced when I was the founding chair of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Again, it was something that Tony Blair appointed me as chairman for the first 5 years of the EITI. This is a tremendous step forward where 1/3 of the board is composed of members of civil society organizations. 1/3 represents the business community, including big companies like Shell and BP and Vale and so on. And 1/3 represents governments. And it is this interaction of these three actors in what Habermas, the German philosopher, would call deliberative democracy, where each one at the same eye level presents their own interests, their own perspectives, their own positions in order to come to a consensus on important issues. And this is what has happened in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, where we have now a tremendous step forward in the oil and gas and mining sector. I'm trying to create something similar in the fisheries sector, and I think we have succeeded to set up a system where 5 coastal countries of Africa, Senegal, Guinea, Mauritania, Mozambique, and the Seychelles, to be with some non-African countries like Indonesia, Peru, and Chile, to set up a system to improve the governance of fisheries. In fisheries, the artisanal fishermen who cannot find any fish anymore because fishing fleets from Spain or from China or from Russia are emptying their fishing grounds. This is how we have to support them to create an enabling environment for artisanal fishermen to stay in their villages in Senegal and not come to Germany and try to make a living in the Black Forest. So this is basically what we are trying to do in the fisheries sector. We are trying to do something similar in other sectors like in the off-grid electricity access. And all of this, by the way, is very much supported by a successor organization of the Africa Progress Plan, which former President Obasanjo has created in Abuja about 2 years ago, when the Africa Progress Plan went out of business. So the vice chairman of or the co-chairman of this organization here is now chairing in his presidential library the attempt to create an organization which will be able to respond to this very generous compact with Africa, which has just been presented to you. Because the important thing is the Africans don't like to be treated like beggars. They want to develop their own concepts, and they have their own concepts. And therefore, it's difficult for them to swallow a terminology like master plan or things like that, because that gives them the sense they are not taken seriously. So what we are trying to do in the Africa Progress Group, as the organization of President Obasanjo is called now, we are trying to build a bridge to make sure that all the good things which are being offered in Europe right now, including the compact with Africa, that this is being accepted and adapted to what the strategies are, which the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa, and previous efforts like this have produced and put on record as the African program. And I consider today's meeting here very much as a part of this African formulation of what is needed in Africa. This is why I'm so pleased to be able to talk to you, and I apologize that I talked too long.
Thank you so much. Let's give a big round to all of the panel. And we'll have some questions. But first, I'd like to take my prerogative as the moderator to ask a couple questions, and we'll stay on the topic of corruption. But I do have something on. I'll ask about Mr. Zalesky about the space environment, investment environment as well. We talked a lot about sensational cases involving corruption. One of the ones, my background as a media and a journalist, that's really struck me was in 2005, the circumstances surrounding a telecommunications license in Iran, which at the time was a virgin market. There had never been a telecommunications license given to a private company. And really quickly, for those of you who don't know the details of this, at first, the Iranians announced, the government announced that the winner of that bid had been Turkcell, which is the main Turkish telecommunications provider. And then about a month later, it announced, no, actually, just kidding, the winner was MTN, which all of you are probably familiar with. MTN is one of the main telecommunications provider in South Africa. And say what you will about Erdogan, but he's not going to roll over on things like that. So the Turkish government has been following this up in litigation, which is the only way that we in the media have found out about some of the sensational details in this case, which apparently what had happened, according to documents from litigation, is that there had been a quid pro quo agreed between the government of Iran and MTN, whereby the government of Iran would have access to advanced South African weapon systems through trade if the license went to the South African company rather than a Turkish company. This is an absolutely sensational case. Involves how Iran has been able to avoid sanctions, but we have no knowledge of this case without prosecution. You started your remarks talking about, and also the Deputy Secretary General was talking about how we changed legislation regarding corruption, where you can prosecute people who are involved in these kind of things. And in this case, I think about 2 weeks ago, there actually was an arrest 14 years after the fact. But it's one thing to change the law. Are there prosecutions being done against companies and individuals who are engaging in these activities? And Turkey is an OECD country, but either panelists like to comment on that.
Well, yes. I mean, we have in Germany about 120 cases pending of German companies which were continuing to bribe outside Germany. So this is a tremendous success. Some people think that corruption is now worse than before, but no. In the past, these companies would have been rewarded with a tax write-off rather than being put in jail. So right now, there are some very, very serious cases against a number of companies. And I must say I'm very happy about it, because for the OECD anti-bribery convention has been signed in 1997, became effective in 1999, and some of the signatories haven't done anything to really prosecute their own nationals. For instance, Japan has done extremely little. I told you the story about the UK with a particular arms contract. In Germany, I must say, they have started right away to take up cases of foreign bribery, and you may remember that the Siemens, for instance, was punished very severely a couple of years ago. Its leadership has been exchanged. For me, a very sad story, because I was very friendly with the CEO of Siemens, who had joined us as Transparency International to help us to get the OECD Convention on the books. But then later they were trapped by this new legislation. So there is indeed a change. But it's much more important than simply changing the laws to actually create a consensus in the business community that bribery is extremely damaging to them also, in the governments, in the civil society, that they have to take this seriously. There are still too many countries which claim that they are honest. For instance, when you go to Beijing and talk to the Chinese authorities, they say we never allowed our business people, our investors, to bribe outside, which you did, the Germans. But and therefore we don't allow it. But I think the Chinese presence in Africa right now is really tainted by their habit to promote these outdated methods, their investments and their interventions in Africa. This has gradually been recognized. I spoke once to a Minister of Mines of Ghana, and he said, well, this is no problem for us. We take the best offers we have under our procurement system, or whenever we have an open bidding system for oil or mining development, then we take the best offer. And we don't accept bribes anymore, because you know how terrible it was when the Europeans right in that, and basically taught our leadership how to betray their own people and ruin our economies by accepting bribes and taking the wrong decisions in terms of the economy. It's interesting that you mentioned this case about the procurement, because we have a relatively holistic approach. I thought we wanted to discuss this in a later session when we talk about production. For instance, procurement is for us an extremely important issue. And I personally, I was in the legal department of the World Bank in charge of procurement and the World Bank loans. The World Bank was always very keen to make sure that when they spend money on a particular project, that the suppliers are selected on the basis of competitive bidding and so on. But what the World Bank did not do at the time was to stop bribing. And now they do. And now, of course, the procurement system, for instance, the World Bank finance projects, is much, much stronger and much more effective than it was before I got into the corruption battle, before Jim Walton came and basically turned the World Bank help and to work like that. I don't know whether you want to say something about this.
Yeah, I think this is, what you're saying is very important. I mean, I'm glad you think the multi-stakeholder approach is very important because, you know, it kind of puts relationship much more at the partnership level. And it shows that we're in this game together. And, you know, I think increasingly industrialized companies realize that bribing and whatever else you can do, you know, child labor, you know, not complying with environmental standards, all this can haunt you for a long time into the future. And that's, in a way, the merit of the media in conjunction with the agreement on these standards. And you know, the fact that we have a lot more better ways to disseminate things today. So I think companies are realizing that, you know, bribing today may haunt you in 10 years. And the OECD, the G20 has designed these standards. I mean, on your initiative, on other people's initiative, it wasn't people at the OECD that came up with this idea. But I mean, if I can mention export financing as another point that I raised before, you know, if there are countries that basically dump certain projects on African countries, that way African countries contract a lot of debt, and there's big dissatisfaction in the international community. It will haunt the Chinese in the future if, you know, they will be accused of causing the over-indebtedness in certain African countries. And if then on top of it, maybe the investment projects do not live up to the quality standard, that's an additional reputational risk. So I think this is something that Western countries should take very seriously, but also African countries should take very seriously from their own end. You know, the bribery convention is basically something that Western countries on the supply side have signed up to. But there's a demand side. And on that demand side, you need in every country, you need strong state, simple, good rules of the game, so that, you know, the private sector can flourish and that you do not create opportunities for corruption, where things become so complicated that, you know, you cut the red tape by paying somebody off, or, you know, the fees are so high that, you know, you pay a bribe to circumvent them. And it's you know, it's this side, so to speak, of some of the G20 or OECD standards that African countries, to my mind, should look at, and private investors should look at to see that it is done in a manner that it delivers what they want. Most development is a quiet process. It's a quiet process of many little people. It's not the big court cases. The big court cases change the perception in the public. But it's the thousands and thousands of private entrepreneurs that cause the development of a country. Samsung is the visible one in Korea, but it was much more than that it took to develop. And in Germany, it is much more than Siemens and so on. So, and these people, they need the security of the law, and for that, some of the things that I've mentioned could help. And so that is my plea here. Technology. And I think this is where you can come in, and where you have here from the Grameen Bank, Steve Halliworth, who was telling me that some of the technology development can also help today to increase transparency, to facilitate business interactions, and to make it much more difficult for bureaucrats, for corrupt people to stifle their entrepreneurs and their economies. And this use of technology to allow that to happen, and I assume it will be part of later sessions, so I don't want to comment more in detail. But here, rule of law and technology could together in your countries really, I think, provide opportunities that we have so far not really had and not really been able to exploit.
Thank you so much for that. Before I open the floor to questions, I wanted to ask Mr. Zaleski about the aerospace industry. And in particular, we've heard a lot about the African space race. A lot of African countries are investing heavily in this. We had we're hoping to have tomorrow for you His Excellency the Ambassador of Angola, who could not join us this morning. But his country recently attempted to launch AngolaSat-1. I think it was their first satellite, subcontracted through Russia, I believe, or maybe Kazakhstan. And it was a failure, but they're still going to invest more in this. Morocco is certainly a country that has invested heavily in the African space race. And geographically speaking, as I understand it, you can clarify this maybe, and from the investment perspective, Africa is where you want to invest for the space race, because Kenya, Tanzania are, if you look at the planet, it's easier to get into space from those because of where the equator is and so forth. I've heard that case made. You can tell me if that's an economic case or just geostrategically something that these governments like to promote. But yes, if you could offer some thoughts on where we are in terms of investment in that. Yeah.
Yes, of course. What you said is correct. So geographically, there should be some advantages. But I believe that for Africa, the best advantage is if they could develop their own competencies. Because as far as there's a lot of initiative, especially in the downstream sector, for the application. But in order to have application based on space-related data, so you need some space asset. And what if these space assets would not belong to you, but belong to Western countries? There will be always the man in the middle. You will always rely on someone else's technologies and someone else's platform for your growth. So that's why I think that in the mid to long term strategy, Africa has to develop maybe, as a continent, their own strategy. Because usually it's quite difficult as a single country to develop their own one space strategy. We know, and also at European level, of course, Germany, France, Italy, and the UK try to do that. But if we don't have European Space Agency, we can never compete with NASA and the Chinese. And moreover, as I said before, we also have to look at the private investors. So if we want to develop the new era, we need private companies to invest in space, in technologies, and in order to do that, also in Africa, as I said before, we need to set up the proper environment. And because the smallest the company are, the worse this condition can act for the small company. Because the small company usually do not have the power as the big company act through international agreement and at government level, but usually they work at business level. If you are not in a good environment, it's always difficult. And as a businessman, if I can do something in a good environment, it's good for me. If I cannot, I will have to go elsewhere. But I believe that there should be really a lot of potential in the future of Africa.
Well, let's open the floor to questions on that optimistic note of a lot of potential for the sector, and I will come around to those of you who have questions. Also, tweet at CWA Summit, and we will also take questions that arrive via Twitter. But this lady in the back is the first person I've seen with a question.
Thank you. Good morning. distinguished guests, Your Excellencies. My name is Aya Day. I am a grants executive for the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, and so we are definitely one of the stakeholders in terms of investing in Africa's future. I've also had the privilege to actually participate in formulating a youth agenda for the African heads of states and European heads of states in 2017. And a part of that youth agenda, we looked at the role of young people. And this morning, what surprises me is that we haven't talked more about social entrepreneurship. And actually, I think later on in today's program, we have a lot of space to talk about managing business and investment in Africa in relation to corruption. I felt the messages this morning quite negative and uninspiring in terms of looking at the positive aspects of development on the continent, particularly for young people. There are a lot of young people that my organization is currently supporting in various ways who have a great many ideas, not only in terms of creating better, more robust leadership on the continent, but also tackling the serious social inequality that still exists, and looking at creative and inspiring and interesting ways of driving that change forward. So if we're looking at the stakeholders in the room today, my question to the panel would be, what inspiring message do you have for young people who are not only interested in becoming entrepreneurs, but social entrepreneurs that recognize business and social development go hand in hand, and how do we approach that in a sustainable fashion, bearing in mind the wealth of resources that Africa has at its disposal and the dependency on the global technological industries when it comes to our natural resources. Thank you.
Well, talking about corruption is not very inspiring, that's true. And my advice in the beginning when I addressed the meeting with a salute was we have to be honest. I mean, this is extremely delicate. So, I mean, we have a world that is very poorly governed. We don't have proper global governance. I'm not only talking about Africa, I'm talking about the world. The economy, the markets are global, but the decisive actors in trying to supervise and regulate the economy are national, or in some cases, say Europe, a combination of a couple of countries. So there is an asymmetry between what you want to regulate, which is global, and the geographical reach you have. There's also an asymmetry in terms of the time horizon of the decision makers. So if you have some politicians in Germany or in the UK or in America, they think in terms of maintaining their power within electoral periods. So they're talking about 4 years, 5 years, 3 years, and therefore the long-term issues, like for instance climate change, like destruction of the environment, like overfishing and so on, they are not on their screen because they have a different time horizon. And I'm talking even about the most wise and the most responsible politicians. It is inherently a way in which they have to maintain power within very short time snippets, basically. There's also a asymmetry when it comes to the constituencies of these decision makers. So when you're talking to a Bavarian group of voters, you cannot really say much about changing the fishing grounds in Mauritania because they don't care. So this is basically the reality which we have to face, and therefore I'm fighting for a different paradigm of governance, a paradigm which is driven not only by national governments and their political parties and their interest to maintain power, but also by the other actors. And one important actor is the private sector, and in particular the international players who don't know any national borders. To the contrary, I mean, they use the national borders in order to demand from governments to live up to their interests. The governments don't dare to take decisions to raise taxes or to raise other issues. Now, and civil society organizations, the big ones, like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and so on, Transparency International, but also the smaller ones. So this is multi-stakeholder approach which I'm trying to advocate here in order to get better governance. Right now, our governance simply means that $50 billion is stolen every year from Africa. More than the whole lending program of the World Bank to Africa, more than the whole ODA to Africa. And why? Because to some extent the investment outside Africa is more stable, is more lucrative, and so on. So Africans invest outside Africa. But also in order to steal. I mean, there's a lot of transfer pricing, say, within a company running a mine, say, in Zambia, and their holding company in Switzerland, and a corporate relative who sits in the Bahamas. And therefore the pricing between the copper, for instance, that is sold on the international market is totally unrealistic. So this idea right now, which has been promoted here in London at the Anti-Corruption Summit, to look after the beneficial ownership of companies which are operating in Africa is extremely important. So these are the issues which we are addressing. It's not very inspiring. I'm sorry about it. I mean, you are talking about social business. I don't know what you mean with social enterprise. In my books, social enterprise is something which does not allow the owners of taking dividends from their enterprises. This is something which they do. I mean, I'm a social entrepreneur in Germany. I have a couple of enterprises which I put my time in and my money and so on in order to help to build a hospital in Africa or something like that. But this is something that is not a recipe for young African entrepreneurs. And social enterprise is something that is good for the public good, but it's not necessarily an incentive for young Africans who want to start a business. So they will be supported by social enterprises, like by BRAC or by the Grameen Bank and so on. But social enterprises as such, in my books, and my definition, are not really the recipe of success for young entrepreneurs. So to be more positive, yes, I mean, for instance, on the technology side, I'm sure that Strive Masiyiwa knows a lot about technology. I'm sure he is investing in some of the space companies which exist. I'm sure that Mo Ibrahim knows a lot about it. I'm sure that there are a lot of African entrepreneurs who invest as owners and investors in the space industry. But to recommend at this point, when you still have countries like Somalia or a number of other countries, Congo, suffering from tremendous epidemics from violent conflict, to think of a global space agency for Africa, I don't know. This is not my highest priority, but I agree with the other speaker that Africa should play a role in this. But I'm sure they have access with their pilot systems and global to satellites which are funded and which are put up into the sky by Western companies. So, but I'm not an expert in this area, and don't want to get into a fight with my neighbor. But I think it's very important to see that you have people who are fighting the evil of corruption, of mismanagement, of environmental destruction, and trying to be helpful. And I'm doing this since 25 years. I created Transparency International exactly 25 years ago. And even if it's not very inspiring, the C word, for instance, corruption, as contrast with the B word, which is so important here right now. And the C word was not mentioned at the time, and he brought it out, and he now created a mood where the world wants to get rid of corruption. and I think we should all help in this.
Maybe I can compliment a bit, and I hope it's sufficiently inspiring. Peter mentioned the role that the international community can play, and I stressed the role of the OECD, and also this change at the level of governments, international and national. This requires, so to speak, the top-down side, but it also requires the bottom-up side. So here would be my inspiring message to your young entrepreneurs. Get your leaders to change. That's one thing. The second one is don't be ashamed of trying to get rich, but try to get rich without, so to speak, criminal means, without these things. Work hard, seize opportunities, use the technologies, keep your great spirit up. Because in my meetings with entrepreneurs from African countries, I've always admired this spirit. So this is hard. It's much harder than in our rich and saturated countries where the rule of law applies. And you can do these things quite easily. You don't have to worry about corruption and these things. So this would be my advice, and I think that many people will succeed. As Peter said, the social side of it is very important. But without people wanting to get rich, development will not take place. Sorry to say that.
I have a quick also bit on this discussion. I totally agree with you. So maybe the priority, I agree with you, is not always technology, neither space. It's a vision. But you stole my word. I want to say exactly what you said. So, as an entrepreneur, I believe that if I have a company grow up in a country that develop knowledge and competencies in that country, pay taxes in that country, have people that have their own families living and asking for services and goods in that country, being more rich in that country, this is a social act. So we do not have always to think about social entrepreneurship as free beer. It's not free beer, it's free speech. So we need to think about making our own future with our own company according to the regulation and not with robbery and stolen something from a country to get it to somewhere else. That's my message.
Okay, we'll take the next question over here. Please identify yourself when you ask a question, but in this case, it is one of our speakers, Dr. Susie Davenport-Doyle, Queen of GB Gupta, CEO of Right for Education.
Thank you very much. I have really kind of two questions. I run Right for Education, the largest independent social media page in Africa. I know the opinion of 7.5 million people in 45 countries on subjects from health to corruption to environment to gender equality. And entrepreneurship is a large topic that we cover. And one topic, and most Africans know about it, they would say, well, I would like to work with England or would like to work in France and Germany, but the lead time is shocking. It's just a waste of time. And they say, what we now do is we talk to the Germans and the French and the English and we get their opinions. In the end, we go with the Chinese because in the end, that's a decision which is going to happen. And I've watched a lot of large activities going on in Africa with European companies. The lead time is shocking. And they say we do it to be careful and avoid corruption. We do it in the comfort of our home, of having electricity and food and roads. and the Africans in the meantime have none of that. And I do think there's an unevenness in the position. Now my second point is actually a different one, and here I would like to know the expert advice, and because it's a question I keep discussing in my head. We're talking corruption, and in many ways we know what corruption is. We give money to somebody who then gives us the contract. What is, where is the difference between the easy end, where it's a handshake and we give a job to a friend, which is a minor thing, and that part of corruption I think is not so relevant. But the large part of corruption where we talk of contracts, for example, the CFA in France. So all French, I'm not sure whether the audience is aware of it, but all ex-French colonies in Africa cannot convert their money from, let's say, Togolese money into dollars. They have to change it from Togolese money into CFA and then into dollars. The calculated number of profit for France on that front lies between 400 and 500 billion. 400 and 500 billion a year. And that is that includes the CFA, but also includes that France has first priority of buying anything that comes out of Africa. Now, and also they have to pay rent for all colonial buildings, which is interesting too. So, would it be under, where is that corruption, or is it just illegal boundaries which are designed under strict rules and regulations and no choice? And do you, in the corruption expert, consider those aspects? I think the trade deal between the European Union and Africa would be a very good example for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we'll take 2 more questions so we get a little bit more ideas out on the floor before we go back to this gentleman back here had a question. We'll go here.
My name is Akinika Olushola Edako. I'm from Ibadan, Oyo State in Nigeria. My question is, what are the ways the African can take to have effective procurement and supply chain system that can curb or eradicate corruption in Africa? Because it is through the procurement of goods and services and works that our leaders are embezzling and laundering and misuse our natural resources that are meant for the development of our continent. And also, how can we promote supply chain as a system to develop our continent, because we're still lacking supply chain in Africa as a whole. Moreover, here in the Western world, they have almost 98% use of supply chain. That's my question. Thank you.
I believe you also.
Professor Chris Imafida, I chair the Excellence in Education program. I just wanted to find out from the panelists what role that you think education can play in radically altering the national outcomes. Because I was delighted that Sherry Booth, QC, made a brief tangential reference to that. Because whatever we do, if we don't develop the skills, the talents that is in across the board, no matter how much oil we have, it's still going to dry out. But if you have the skills to do it, so I'm keen on hearing your views on that.
I'll start. I'll give it a shot and see. I think that unevenness that the first questioner mentioned is very important. I mean, if our companies and our governments take a lot of time because they are very afraid to do something wrong, they have to follow all kinds of bureaucracy, well, that's, I think, something we should look at. But it also gives an opportunity to Africans, to Chinese and others who are faster. And I'm not having too much pity with my European friends and the companies if they don't take advantage of the opportunities because they don't have the courage. The key is that the Chinese companies or the Turkish or the Moroccan or whoever you own, that they comply by the rules of the game. So this is, I think, our job at the international level to make sure that the rules of the game are right and support your countries, the African countries' efforts in this regard. I think that is really the key. If then the money is made by the Chinese, so be it. But the Chinese have to subscribe, and that's what we have to work at. Then at the local level, at the national level, procurement is of course one of the key channels and challenges. And again, I can only mention there are some OECD-sponsored instruments that aim to prevent all the corruption and misgivings and mismanagement through procurement in state-owned enterprises and so on. But it's the governments that have to, so to speak, want to do the change. And just signing an OECD paper doesn't change it either. You have to change it locally. And sometimes it's maybe better not to have the state-owned enterprises and not to have the government intervention and to let it happen by the private sector because, it's just too difficult to control. And that brings me to the last point. I mean, I think in countries where government revenue is very limited and where the institutional capacities are limited, it's important to focus on the key things. What are the key things for government to do? It's really the institutional framework that I mentioned. It is not to run state-owned enterprises that do things that the private sector can do equally well. The key thing is education. I've seen in Tanzania excellent private schools, so it's not probably even to provide all the education, but to create a framework conditions that generate a good education system. Because if you look at the history of, I don't want to say mankind, that sounds so pompous, but if you look at the economic history of countries in the world, education and education-related productivity explains 50 or 75% of the difference across countries. If you have strong education standards, if you have strong education outcomes, then your chance of growing fast, of having higher productivity increase are much better. But you also have to provide education that is value-added, that actually teaches children something, that teaches skills that can be used, that are demanded in the market, and where it's not just the unions, kind of controlling a backward system and preventing that the children learn something. The state preventing good schools from emerging. So this is, even education is an incredibly difficult balancing act of how you want to get good education standards. Again, the OECD is doing a lot of work also in African countries in this area, and I don't want to sound like a vacuum cleaner salesperson, but there are means if you as a government are interested in improving your education system. There is not one right way, there are many right ways, but focusing on education in governments that have limited resources and that need to prioritize, I think, is the right priority.
I think he has said it all, but I would like to make one comment about a bias which I discovered in his answer. A bias which seems to assume that the private sector is automatically less prone to corruption than the public sector, and this is absolutely wrong. In most corruption cases, the private sector plays the most proactive role. It was before 1999. It was the promoters from Europe who went down to Africa to tell sort of underpaid ministers and unstable governments to, if they need some stability, they should open up a bank account in Liechtenstein or in the Bahamas. And they could get a couple of $1 million if they go ahead with a certain project which was not really needed, which was overpriced, overdesigned, and very harmful to the economy and to the environment in Africa. So we also deal with corruption within the private sector. We had huge cases where, for instance, suppliers of Volkswagen, private companies, were driving purchasing agents of Volkswagen and so on. So, I mean, the idea that the private sector is more innocent is a myth which I would like to very strongly oppose. And the same thing is true with education. I mean, the private education which some rich people can afford. I lived in Kenya for a couple of years, and my kids went to an international school. It was private. And yes, this was a privilege which I was able to enjoy. But to conclude from there that in Africa, private education would be a good recipe for improving education. And my answer to you, Professor, is yes, training, education, extremely important. In fact, President Obasanjo at one point told me he had once asked a little child in Nigeria and asked him what he wants to do in the future. And that child said, I want to be a civil servant because I want to get a Mercedes-Benz. So he didn't say, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a doctor, and so on. But rather from very early on in the corrupt system, children moved into that direction because they have to survive in that corrupt system. And in that sense, of course, the earlier question was very important. We believe, as I said earlier, in a holistic approach. Procurement is part of it. And even in Germany, procurement is sort of like a barn door where corruption enters into the decision-making of German government. If they have unemployment in a certain sector, or if they have unemployment in a certain region, and so on, very quickly politicians come out and say, why don't we close an eye to the rules of proper procurement and try to get some of the local people to get the jobs and so on. So I mean, it's something which is extremely important, and which brings me to the last point. Governments, he is right, are eventually the only legitimate agents of taking decisions in society. But they don't do it. They don't do it unless they are forced by civil society, by the private sector, with different perspectives, with different interests, to do it. So in Germany, for instance, we are struggling with the German government about improving political party financing. In Germany, we are fighting for better public information legislation, which Scandinavia has, for instance, in a way which makes Scandinavia shine in our Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. They always come out much, much better than Germany, because in Germany it is still very hard for people to get access to information from the government. So I mean, in each country it is necessary that civil society is organized to put sound pressure and work with the government and work with the private sector in order to find solutions. So this is my message, because governments alone don't do it unless they feel the pressure. And this is why I'm so happy that I can talk to you here, because you are exactly the right group of multipliers and carry that message. You have to strengthen civil society in your society in order also to define, if I can talk to the Queen for a moment. You asked me how we define corruption. Corruption is the misuse of public entrusted authority for personal gain. So it has nothing to do with payments. Sometimes it's payment, sometimes it's something else. But this is a very broad definition, and the now this skeleton is a responsibility of the national chapters in their own society, their own culture, and their own traditions, to define what they consider to be the most harmful corruption to address first. So this is extremely important. So it's a very complicated approach, but most people know exactly what's corrupt.
So what happens if it's legal?
When it's legal, it's not corruption. Corruption is illegal.
I think we'll have.
It's not corruption.
All right, I think we'll have to. You can finish that discussion on after the panel. Unfortunately, due to time, and one of the speakers has another engagement, we'll have to end this panel now. Please give all the speakers a warm round of applause.